different. There is a population living at the northern edge of Japan whose genome does not behave the way the textbooks said it should. For over a century, they were treated as a footnote, a remnant, a relic, the last trace of an older Japan swallowed by a newer one. Their language was dying, their land had been renamed, their history had been folded quietly into someone else's national story. And for a long time, that seemed to be the whole account. Then scientists sequenced their DNA, and the DNA did not agree. What it revealed was not a simple remnant population fading at the margins of history. It was something stranger, a genome carrying signals from the deep Pleistocene, from Siberian coastlines, from a vanished maritime culture, and from an admixture event more recent and more complicated than anyone expected. The story that emerged was not smaller than the old one. It was larger, older, and far less finished. This is the story of the Ainu people of Hokkaido and what their DNA revealed when researchers finally looked closely enough. For most of modern history, the accepted narrative was tidy. Japan, the story went, had two ancestral populations. First came the Jomon hunter-gatherers who lived across the Japanese archipelago for more than 10,000 years. Leaving behind their distinctive cord-marked pottery and a deeply isolated genetic signature. Then, starting around the first millennium BCE, waves of Yayoi migrants arrived from the Asian mainland. Bringing rice agriculture, bronze, and a new wave of ancestry that mixed with the Jomon population and eventually became the genetic and cultural foundation of modern mainland Japanese society. In this framework, the Ainu occupied a very specific role. They were cast as the population that mixing bypassed the group that stayed closest to the original Jomon template while the rest of the archipelago transformed. Historians called it the dual structure model, and it explained a great deal. It explained why Ainu material culture, physical traits, and oral traditions looked so different from those of mainland Japan. It explained the deep divide between Hokkaido and Honshu. It gave the Ainu a place in the story, the keepers of Japan's oldest layer, untouched while history moved on around them. It was a clean model. It was also, researchers would later argue, too clean. The first cracks did not come from genetics at all. They came from archaeology and material culture details that quietly refused to fit the isolated remnant story. Ainu material culture did not look like a simple continuation of Jomon life. Something had clearly changed in Hokkaido between the end of the Jomon period and the emergence of the historical Ainu. New tools appeared, new burial customs appeared. Iron and bronze objects, clearly acquired through long-distance contact, showed up in the archaeological record and along the northern coastline. A maritime culture known as the Okhotsk people, hunters of sea mammals, with roots stretching toward Sakhalin and the Amur River basin, had established a very real physical presence in Hokkaido for centuries. If the Ainu were simply Jom people who never mixed, this presence was a problem, a population sitting directly on the geography of the Okhotsk maritime tradition, absorbing their tools, their techniques, possibly their people, and yet supposedly untouched by them. That asymmetry did not sit well. Something in the story was incomplete. Oral tradition added its own layer of friction. Hence, Ainu narratives spoke of northern peoples, of contact and conflict along the Sakhalin Strait, of movement and exchange that did not resemble total isolation. Isolation was the assumption written into the textbooks. And it was not obviously the assumption held by the people themselves. This is where genetics entered, not to confirm the old model, but to test it against a far deeper archive than pottery shards or written record, the archive written directly into human cells. Researchers turned first to mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed almost unchanged from mother to child across generations, then to Y chromosome DNA, tracing the paternal line. Later came whole genome sequencing, reading not just isolated markers, but the full inherited code, compared against ancient remains and against modern populations spread across Siberia, Sakhalin, mainland Japan, and the wider East Asian mainland. What they found did not simply confirm the old dual structure model, it complicated it. Mitochondrial studies did show that the Ainu retained strong maternal lineages traceable to the Hokkaido Jomon population. The Ainu still retain the matrilineage of the Hokkaido Jomon people site. That much lined up. But the same research found something the old model had not prepared anyone for. Site Index 5.1. The Siberian influence on this population is far greater than previously recognized. And the influence of mainland Japanese is evident as well, especially in the region of Hokkaido, closest to Honshu site. This was not a rounding error, it was a second and third ancestral thread, woven directly into a population that had been described for generations as essentially unmixed. That was not a contradiction, it was a signal. Y chromosome data added another layer entirely. A particular paternal lineage, haplogroup D, associated with the deep Jomon ancestral layer, turned out to be carried by an extraordinarily high proportion of Ainu men, site index 6.1 present at roughly 81% among Ainu males in Hokkaido, compared with about 36% among mainland Japanese men site. On its own, that number looks like confirmation of deep, undiluted Jomon ancestry, but paternal lineages and whole genome ancestry do not always tell the same story. Best Site Index 6-1 researchers have noted that autosomal whole genome contribution from hunter-gatherer ancestry was often comparatively modest, even where the associated Y chromosome haplogroups persisted at high frequency, suggesting a pattern of male-biased gene flow across the archipelago's history site. In other words, the paternal line and the rest of the genome were not always narrating the same past. The story did not collapse, it widened. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven unraveling of assumed history, this is a good moment to subscribe, because almost every population on Earth turns out to be more layered than its official story suggests. With the picture destabilized, researchers found themselves weighing several competing explanations rather than settling on one. The first was continued admixture with the Okhotsk maritime culture, the idea that the historical Ainu formed not simply from Jomon continuity, but from a genuine merger between Hokkaido's Jomon descendants and the seafaring Okhotsk people who arrived from the north. Genetic and archaeological researchers increasingly treat this as central rather than peripheral. Site Index 3.1 recent studies suggest that the descendants of the Hokkaido Jomon people had admixed with the Okhotsk people and became the ancestors of the modern Ainu site. The Okhotsk themselves, appear to have shared ancestry with populations further north and west along the Siberian coast groups like the Nivk and Ulchi near the mouth of the Amur River. The second explanation was a slower, ongoing gene flow with mainland Japan itself, not a single dramatic mixing event, but centuries of contact, trade, and intermarriage along the strait separating Hokkaido from Honshu. Concentrated most heavily near the southern edge of Ainu territory, The third possibility, and in some ways the most unsettling, was that the Jomon population itself was never a single uniform genetic block to begin with. Analysis of ancient Jomon remains from different parts of the archipelago has found distinct maternal lineages in the north and south. One researchers have labeled N9B1 in the north and M7A in the south, hinting that even the foundational Jomon population carried internal structure. Our regional differentiation that existed long before Yayoi migrants ever arrived. If that is correct, the Ainu were never a frozen fragment of a single ancestral Japan. They were one branch of a Jomon world that was already internally diverse. Well, none of these explanations were mutually exclusive. That in itself was the deeper discovery. The truth did not sit neatly in one box. The moment that reshaped the field most decisively came with the sequencing of actual ancient Jomon genomes, not modern Ainu DNA used as a stand-in for the past, but genetic material extracted directly from Jomon-era human remains and compared. At whole genome resolution against population across Eurasia, this mattered because earlier research had often relied on modern Ainu individuals as a proxy for pure Jomon ancestry, a shortcut that researchers now recognize was never entirely accurate. Cite Index 6-1 modern Ainu individuals derive an estimated 79% of their ancestry from Hokkaido Jomon populations, and with the remainder coming from other, more recent admixture events cite, meaning even the reference population, held up as the closest living link to ancient Japan, was itself a blend. The ancient genomes told an even more striking story about how deep this ancestry runs. Analysis of a Jomon-era individual sequenced directly from remains rather than inferred from living descendants indicated that Site Index 7-1, this ancestral component, reaches its highest frequency in the Hokkaido Ainu, averaging close to 79%. While smaller portions of the same deep lineage also surface in present-day Honshu Japanese and in the Ulchi people of the Amur region cite a single ancestral thread, in other words. Stretching from an ancient hunter-gatherer population in Japan all the way to a modern community on the Siberian mainland. Researchers have also estimated that Site Index 7-1 admixture between Jomon-descended and continental East Asian ancestry occurred approximately 1,700 to 2,200 years ago in Honshu. While a distinct and notably more recent admixture event, occurring only 17 to 25 generations ago, was detected specifically within the Hokkaido Ainu, consistent with ongoing gene flow between the Ainu and mainland Japanese populations continuing well after the classical period site. That is the twist the old model never anticipated. And not simply that mixing happened, but when and how recently. The Ainu were not a population frozen at the end of the Jomon period, quietly waiting out the centuries while the rest of Japan changed around them. They were a population still actively forming, still absorbing new ancestral threads from the north and from the south well into the historical era, not the static remnant of an old world. A population still writing its own genome into relatively recent memory. Why does this matter beyond one island and one people? Because it dismantles a habit of mind, not just a model of Japanese prehistory. It is tempting when telling the story of any population to imagine an ancient pure starting point and then a slow, one-directional drift away from it, as if history were a single river running downstream. And what the Ainu genome suggests instead is something closer to a delta. Multiple channels, multiple sources, water moving in more than one direction, merging and separating and merging again. over thousands of years, leaving deposits that later generations mistake for a single simple current. This is not a phenomenon unique to Hokkaido. It appears wherever geneticists look closely enough in the layered ancestry of populations across Siberia, in the folded histories of island communities from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, and in the complicated genetic story hiding beneath almost every population once described in textbooks as isolated or unmixed. Isolation, it turns out, is rarely absolute. It is a matter of degree and of time scale, and often it is simply the story we tell before we have looked closely enough to see the seams. Picture for a moment the strait between Hokkaido and Sakhalin on a winter morning gray water. Moving ice, a coastline where the boundary between Japan and the Siberian mainland has never been as fixed as a modern map suggests. For thousands of years, people crossed that strait. Yes. They followed sea mammals along the coast. They carried tools, techniques, and eventually genes from the Amur River basin down into the northern reaches of the Japanese archipelago. Back again. There was no wall there. There was a channel narrow, cold, and permeable through which human history quietly moved for longer than any single written record survives to describe. And somewhere in that landscape, a Jomon-descended community met a maritime people from the north. They did not vanish into one another. They did not remain untouched by one another. They became something new, something that still today carries the signature of that ancient and unglamorous fact. History is rarely a single lineage. It is almost always a confluence. And this is perhaps the quiet, larger truth the Ainu genome forces into view. The old dual structure model was not wrong because it invented facts. It was too small because it assumed simplicity where complexity had always been present, waiting to be measured. The Ainu are not diminished by this complexity. If anything, they are revealed to be more historically significant than the older story allowed a living record of contact between at least 3 ancestral streams. The deep Jomon lineage of the Japanese archipelago, the northern maritime world of the Okhotsk and their Siberian relatives, and a slow continuing exchange with the peoples of Honshu that never fully stopped. The genome did not erase their story. It restored a chapter that had been left out. Researchers remain cautious about drawing this too far. This does not prove a single migration route, and it does not settle every question about the timing or scale of contact between these populations. Ancient DNA samples remain limited. Every new genome sequenced has the potential to complicate the picture further, not simplify it. That caution is not a weakness in the science. It is the discipline that keeps the story honest. But what the evidence does suggest, clearly and repeatedly, is this. The people who were labeled the unchanged remnant of ancient Japan were never unchanged at all. They were shaped continuously by contact with the sea, with the north, with the mainland, long after the moment historians once assumed their story had already ended. If there is a lesson written into this genome, it may be this. The populations we call the last of something are almost never simply that. They are usually still becoming something quietly, in ways the old maps never had the resolution to see. The Ainu were never a closed chapter of Japanese history. They were, and remain, one of its longest and most unfinished sentences. If stories like this interest you, where the evidence rewrites the map we thought we already understood, subscribe, because the human past holds far more of these buried chapters than most of us realize.